So I break my sketch down into several stages, the first of which is sketching with a pencil. And I go around the scene very quickly, marking everything out in a scribbly, sketchy style, lines crossing over each other. Essentially what I'm doing is just marking out the main parts of the buildings in the scene, any signage that needs lettering, marking out roughly where any letters will go. And there's the main part of the cinema has a big sign, so I wanted to make sure that I had the letters correct. And I spent about 10 minutes on this pencil stage. That's about double the amount of time I would normally spend, but I did get a little bit carried away in this one. I think the idea usually is that you just mark out and it's not supposed to be a drawing, but I tend to get carried away and end up doing a full pencil drawing. But there we are, that's just me. And then I draw in the foreground items, and there's lots of them, like the street lighting, and there's a newspaper box. And that's the end of the super easy pencil sketch stage, and we can now move into the more complicated bit, the ink drawing. So the next thing I do is go over everything with a permanent ink fineliner. For the sketch I'm using a 0.6mm pen. This is a Uni Pin Fineliner. So it's a permanent pigment ink and it is waterproof. So you can paint watercolour over the top of it, which is ideal for this because I will be using watercolour later on once all the drawing is done. So you want an ink that is going to be waterproof and you can draw over it and the lines will still show through. So I start off with all the foreground items, and I thought this one looked quite comical because it does look as though all the street furniture is waiting in a queue for the bus, as though a bus will pull up and they'll all hop on and then they'll all be gone. But I was quite drawn to this scene because there was so much street furniture, lampposts and other objects. That's really what I look for in a scene. I find these sorts of things quite enjoyable to draw. Once all those foreground items are drawn, I can then go in with the background items. And so for this stage, it's about constructing the buildings behind in a way that doesn't make them cross over the foreground items. This is a wee bit tricky, and sometimes I have to stop and think about where the next line is going to go to make sure it's not going to go in the wrong place. I have a very wobbly, wonky, sketchy style, and it allows you to get away with lots of mistakes, so that's something that helps at least. I've drawn a lot of cinemas. I love drawing cinemas, and particularly Art Deco ones. There's quite a few where I'm from in Scotland, and this is the first one I've come across in another country. I was really drawn to the architecture of this building, and it's a real shame that I actually discovered that this is the only Art Deco building of its type in the whole of Alaska, and yet it was abandoned. The cinema was closed down. And I read that apparently a couple of years ago permission was given for the whole building to be torn down and replaced with some kind of shopping mall or something, which is a bit of a shame. That would never happen in the UK where I am. That would be a listed building and there would be protests if people did it. I mean, I think there are actually websites and stuff of people trying to stop it happening, but I don't know if it has actually happened yet. I don't know if this cinema no longer exists as a building, so this may be a bit of a historical sketch in some ways. So I'm building up all the layers of detail, and there's lots in this one. As you can see, this was a big sketch. I think in total this took me almost 4 hours, which is one of the longest sketches I've ever done. But I wasn't in any rush. I had a whole evening to myself to sit and sketch, and it is mad when you get drawing something like this. You just get so lost in the detail of it, and there just seems like an endless number of things that you haven't noticed that you have to go back in and add. And this feels like one of those sketches where it's going quite well with the actual drawing stage, and then you start the watercolour and you wish you hadn't. Really part of the reason I'm doing these videos is that I want to experiment and try things out, and I'm going to post the results regardless of how they turn out, but this is one of the ones where I was really quite pleased with how the ink stage came out, and then the more and more work I did on the colour stage that comes after, the less enthused I was about the end result. But what I always say to myself and try to say to others is that it's not the end result that counts, it's the taking part, it's the drawing, and it's the enjoyment of sitting down and sketching, whether you're on location or from a photo. So once I was finished the ink drawing stage, I rubbed out the pencil marks with a putty eraser to get things all neat and tidy, ready for the dreaded watercolour stage. So I'm using Royal Talens Van Gogh watercolours for this, and I start off with a madder red going over the building on the left hand side. As you can see, I thought it's not an exact colour match, and in fact I don't think any of the colours that I used were exact colour matches, but it's an approximation, and it's an interpretation of the scene. It doesn't have to be exact. This is a nice vibrant phthalo green that I added in next on the signage, and what I was doing through this sketch is jumping around the scene, and there was a reason for that. It was because I wanted to try and avoid smudging the paint, so I was letting one area dry. I'm not going to get paint smudging and running into each other. So it's a burnt umber next. And then raw sienna for the top half. I took a little bit of time to decide what colour to paint that main section of the cinema itself. I don't think I got it exactly right, but raw sienna was about the closest shade that I could find. And then an azure green just to distinguish it from the cinema building. So there are lots and lots of colours in this scene. I do feel like as I went on with this, I was becoming more convinced that I should really use less colour. When I'm doing a sketch with marker pens, I tend to keep it quite minimalistic, and really when I'm doing watercolour, I tend to get carried away and paint almost every inch of the page, and really I think that's something I'm going to try and reduce, and try to get my watercolour sketches more like sketches that I do with marker pens. But it's coming along, and you learn something new every time you do a sketch, and that's the main thing. As long as we're learning, improving and enjoying the process, then that's really all that counts. So a Davies grey is what I used next, and I used that partly for some of the buildings that needed to be grey, and also to go over some of the colours just to dial them down a bit. I thought that the orange that I used for the main part of the building, I was looking for a kind of peach colour, but it didn't quite turn out how I expected, so I went over that main section later on with the same Davies grey to dial it down a bit. And then on the ground I used Payne's grey. Payne's grey is a cooler grey than the Davies grey. Davies grey's got a warm tone to it. and a quinacridone purple red, if that's how you pronounce it. So there we are. I went in with the Davies grey over the top of the central part of the cinema, and that just dialed down the orange, made it not so bright because it was standing out a little bit too much. Then a hook green. These are a lot of colours. I would say there's probably too many different colours, but it's such a colourful scene. I was just trying to do a rough approximation of what was there. I think maybe you could simplify it, even if the real scene has that many colours. Maybe you could reduce the number of colours and create a more unified effect. But I just went full on, pick a colour and splash it on. I was enjoying myself, which is the main thing. I sometimes feel like this is what it's like to be a snooker commentator, when you're sitting here commentating on colours. Oh, he's picked the red. Oh, that's a bad pot. It really is a very strange experience to sit and commentate on your own artwork creations. So at this point I realised that I wish I'd left some more white on the page, because when I'm doing the marker pen sketches I leave lots and lots of white, and I covered almost every inch of the page, and I felt like it was getting a bit too much. So that's something I'm going to try in future to work on. But this is all a big learning process. I feel like I'm much more accomplished as a marker pen sketcher than I am as an ink and watercolour sketcher, but I share these videos because I want to keep learning and sharing what I'm learning, in the hope that it might help others as well. That is pretty much the end of the watercolour stage now, so we can move on to the final stage where I add a bit of contrast with brush markers. I use Faber-Castell Pitt Artist brush pens for this last stage, and in that tray on the right hand side there are a bunch of different colours and also a black. So I use the black brush pen to colour in all the windows, turn all the lights off. When I'm doing a marker pen sketch, I often turn on some of the lights with the yellow pen, but because there's so much colour in this, I decided to turn all the lights off. And the good thing is about these pens is they can go over watercolour, so if you want any bits and pieces to be touched up, you can add these coloured markers over the top of the watercolour. And that was useful. There was a couple of bits that I felt needed to be a bit more vibrant, like the shrubbery, so I added more colour. And it also helped because I'd already packed the watercolours away. So and really I'm not doing much with the marker pens in this, just going around with different shades of grey and the odd dot of colour where it was necessary, just to create the final bits of contrast and tonal variation. But there wasn't an awful lot needed in this, it was just little bits here and there to finish it all off. And as the cold grey markers that I'm using have a softer brush than the firmer tipped ones on the right hand side in the tray, so those ones I really like using for creating tonal contrast because the brushes are much softer and you can get a nice smooth finish. So there we are, that's the final sketch. It's one that I really enjoyed doing, more so than the final result, but I'm still fairly happy with it. I just think in future with my watercolour sketches I'm going to try holding back on the amount of watercolour I'm adding and seeing if I can get a more minimal effect. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please do consider subscribing, and you can visit urbansketchy.com for more sketchy goodness.